I wrote about this actually in one of my books about I had a
Mm-hmm.
chapter about a Mennonite woman whose daughter was abducted and killed a, a, by a monster, sexually abused and killed by a monster, and how even before he was caught, the monster was caught, she forgave him, publicly forgave
Yeah.
him. That's
You said
um,
this is what gave you your faith back.
yeah, that example has stayed with me very strongly, and I believe that we are called on as human beings um, to forgive, and forgiveness is meaningless if we only reserve that privilege for the easy cases, right?
Hmm.
It's only meaningful if we use it in instances where it's really really hard to forgive. And that's why I wanted to do that episode on Helen Levitt. It's really, really hard for me to forgive someone who was a Stalinist in 1955. Really hard for someone who was as fervently anti-communist as I was as a growing up. Um, and so I guess I would ask in these cases, what is the role for forgiveness when people say things that are genuinely um, horrendous or not even horrendous, but no one disputes in
Controversial.
many
Yeah.
controversial in many of these cancel culture cases, people are saying things that are truly problematic. Um,
Hmm.
and I would say, let's ask for maybe the first question we should ask is before anything happens is appropriateness forgiveness is forgiveness appropriate here?
Well,
Can
honestly,
we?
I was looking at it just this morning because the head of the Olympics, the Olympics are now underway in Tokyo, and the head of the Olympics opening ceremony, well, I guess, they're going to have the opening ceremony, but they're getting underway.
Yeah.
Got canned because it turned out he made a joke 20 years ago. And it was apparently he said something like, "Let's play Holocaust" in this
Hmm.
comedy routine he did, which sounds like a stupid joke to me. I mean, I the guy's now been fired from he's put together the whole opening ceremony, and they're like, "We're revamping the entire opening ceremony, to
Hmm.
make sure there's no." I guess hints of the Holocaust. And it was like, come on. That to me,
Yeah.
that seems like a perfect example of a guy who should say, "I'm sorry, that was a dumbass joke. 20 years ago, we were, like, it was a joke. Move on, not everything has to be a cardinal sin." And to
Hmm.
me, Malcolm, it boils down to something you put your finger on in talking to strangers, which is that we are so confident in our own complexity, but we wrongly believe that others are simple.
Yeah.
Strangers who we don't know at all. Totally simple. I've got him pegged. He's I guess an anti-Semite, or he's a bigot. He's something, whatever they're saying about this guy or Chris Harrison or whomever. And
Hmm.
this has been one of my beefs too. That I always quote my therapist: "People are complicated. They're complicated. They are. We've forgotten that. We have
Yeah.
forgotten all about that."
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I wonder whether there is. I've thought about this. That what we need is to going back to this idea of forgiveness. Um, there has to be um, social mechanisms that allow us to that allow for apologies to be given, for forgiveness to be granted, for rehabilitation to be undergone and um, seen as kind of credible. I mean, I'm remembering years ago, my mom told me about. My mom was a therapist, and she told me about a case involving someone in the Mennonite community. This is the old order Mennonite community. So I grew up in this part of Ontario with a lot of traditional Mennonites, people, who don't, who drive horse and buggies like the Amish and don't
Wow.
participate in the 20th century. And she was working on a case with someone who had committed a crime. And she talked to me about how the community chose to deal with this man's transgression. And they had a ceremony. And they all gathered in the church, and the man stood up, and he was required to publicly confess to his sin and to apologize in view of the entire congregation towards the person to whom the person he had wronged. And there's much more to it than that. It was embedded in an entire kind of religious ceremony that talked about biblical ideas of forgiveness and what Jesus teaches us about the importance of forgiveness and all kinds of things. But I'm not saying that That's obviously not appropriate for the secular world we're living in. But it
Mhm.
was interesting to me. I remember she told me, I was a kid at the time she told me this. I've always remembered that because it was an example of a community that had thought seriously about what do we do when someone says something or does something that's deeply wrong, right?
Right,
How
what
do we
does the
cope with
justice
that?
system look like outside
Yeah,
of the courts, right? The moral
exactly.
sort of societal justice
Exactly.
system. And ours right now is so upended and cruel. I mean, it's
It's
just
it's yeah,
really.
yeah, it's the word I would use, I agree. It is also impoverished. It's like there must be more than one way to deal with this. And and we have to get away from the idea that right now we have this notion that if you settle for anything less than the maximum response to a transgression, you are somehow condoning the transgression. That's where I have an issue. I can be every bit as outraged as anyone else by what someone has said or done. But that doesn't mean that I think they should receive the maximum penalty.